She sounded cheerful when she said it. That's what I remember most. Not angry, not apologetic, cheerful, like she was telling me she'd finally cleaned out the garage. Dad, we're moving to Calgary next month. I listed the cottage last week. The offer came in yesterday and I accepted it. I thought you should know. I sat down on the edge of my bed. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, I remember, because the maple outside my window had already gone bare, and there were a few brown leaves stuck to the glass from the rain the night before. I just sat there holding the phone with both hands like it might say something different if I held on long enough. The cottage on Lake Muskoka had been in my family for 31 years. My wife Helen and I bought it the summer our youngest started school. We drove up there in a second-hand Volvo with a canoe strapped to the roof and 2 kids fighting in the back seat. And when we pulled up the gravel lane and saw the water through the pine trees, Helen grabbed my hand and didn't let go for a long time. That was 1993. We spent every August there for 22 years, until she got sick, and then we spent the last 2 summers there together anyway, because she said the sound of the lake helped her sleep. She passed in 2018. I kept the cottage. My son Bradley knew all of this. He grew up there. He proposed to his wife, Anita, there. His daughter took her first steps on that dock. He knew what that place was, and he sold it anyway, and he told me about it after the fact, cheerfully, on a Tuesday morning in October. You sold it, I said. The market up there is incredible right now, Dad. We got almost 400,000 over asking. Didn't make sense to hold on to it. Bradley, that cottage is in my name. There was a pause. Just a short one. I have power of attorney, Dad. You signed it 2 years ago when your hip surgery was scheduled. Remember? In case something happened during the procedure. I did remember. I remembered signing it because the surgery was serious and my doctor had recommended I get my affairs in order temporarily. I remembered specifically asking Bradley's lawyer whether the document was limited to healthcare decisions, and the lawyer, a young man with a tight smile whose name I never trusted myself to remember, had told me it was a general POA but standard, that it was just a precaution. I had not read it carefully enough. That was my mistake, and I have spent a great deal of time since then deciding whether to forgive myself for it. And I think I mostly have. That document was for my surgery, I said. It was not an invitation to sell my property. Dad, the surgeon cleared you 14 months ago. The POA is still active. Anita and I are starting fresh out west, and we needed the capital. The sale closes in 3 weeks. I really think once you've had some time, you'll see this was the practical choice. Practical. He used that word 3 times in that phone call. I counted. After I hung up, I didn't call anyone. I made myself a cup of tea, which I didn't drink, and I sat at my kitchen table in Kingston and looked at the yellow wall Helen had painted the summer before she got sick because she said the kitchen needed to feel like sunlight. I sat there for about an hour. Then I called my old colleague, Frank Delacroix. Frank and I had practiced law together for 19 years. He was semi-retired now, but still kept his license current, and still went into the office on Wednesdays, mostly because he didn't like golf, and his wife hosted a book club on Wednesday afternoons that he found unbearable. I told him everything, start to finish, and he was quiet for a moment. Do you still have the original POA document? He said. I have a copy. Bradley has the original. Get me what you have, and dig out anything related to the cottage, the deed, the purchase agreement, any correspondence about the listing. Frank, can he actually do this? He can try, Frank said. Whether it holds is a different question. Get me the papers. I should explain something about my history before I go further, because it matters. I practiced real estate and estate law for 34 years. I retired 6 years ago, and in the years since I have occasionally let people assume I was simply a retired school teacher or a former civil servant. Because when you tell people you were a lawyer, they either ask you for free advice or they become slightly guarded. And at my age, I find both exhausting. Bradley knew exactly what I had done for a living. He also knew, or should have known, that I had spent 3 decades reading documents that people hadn't read carefully enough, and understanding precisely where those documents could be challenged. What Bradley did not know was that 3 months before the hip surgery, when I had first been consulting with my doctor and the possibility of a procedure was becoming real, I had quietly made some changes. The cottage deed had a clause. It had been there since I drafted a revised ownership agreement in 2019, the year after Helen died, when I was restructuring my estate. It was a clause that required any sale or transfer of the Muskoka property to receive written confirmation from a secondary trustee, a role I had assigned to my longtime friend and former client, a retired judge named Evelyn Marsh, who lived in Ottawa and had known Helen and me since the mid-90s. Evelyn had not been contacted. No one had told her anything, which meant the sale had proceeded without the required trustee confirmation, which meant the sale agreement had a defect, which meant the closing in 3 weeks was not as certain as Bradley believed. I drove to Evelyn's place in Ottawa on a Thursday. She made coffee and shortbread and listened to everything without interrupting, which is a quality I have always admired in her. When I finished, she set down her cup and said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing dramatic," I said. "Just a letter to the purchaser's solicitor, copying the listing agent, noting that the trustee confirmation requirement was not met and that the transaction is therefore in question pending legal review." She wrote the letter that afternoon. The next 48 hours were, I will admit, deeply unpleasant in ways that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings. Bradley called 4 times Friday evening. Anita called twice Saturday morning. The calls were not cheerful. Bradley had been speaking to the listing agent and to his own lawyer, a different young man than the one who had drawn up the PLA, and he had apparently been told, for the first time, about Evelyn's role in the deed. "What is this?" he said on the 4th call. "You set a trap." "I structured my estate," I said. "You sold property that wasn't entirely yours to sell." "Dad, we needed that money. Calgary isn't cheap. We have plans. Anita's sister is out there, her family. The kids will have cousins." "I understand you have plans," I said. "You made those plans using an asset that had legal protections you chose not to investigate. That's not a trap. That's a consequence." He told me I was being vindictive. He told me I was punishing him for trying to make a good life. He told me that Anita's family had already begun looking for schools. He said a number of things and I listened to all of them, and then I said, "Bradley, I love you. I also intend to see this through." He hung up. Frank, in the meantime, had been doing something I hadn't asked him to do, but that turned out to matter considerably. He'd been reviewing the original POA document more carefully, specifically the section outlining the scope of authority. What he found was that the document, as drafted, included language limiting its application to financial decisions required for my direct medical care and recovery. It had been framed narrowly in the original draft. The listing agent and Bradley's first lawyer had taken the existence of a signed POA at face value without reviewing its limitations clause in detail. Frank contacted Ontario's Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee with a formal query regarding unauthorized use of power of attorney documentation for property transactions outside its stated scope. This was not a small thing to do. It triggered a review. I want to be honest here. The following 6 weeks were not triumphant. They were exhausting and sad in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. I didn't sleep well. I found myself driving past the exit for the 400 one afternoon on a trip to the hardware store and just keeping going, driving north for another hour before I turned around, not quite ready to go as far as the Muskoka turnoff, but wanting to be closer to it somehow. I ate too many meals alone at my kitchen table or under Helen's yellow wall. There were moments when I thought, let it go. Take the money once the sale resolves. Buy something smaller. Move on. But I kept coming back to those August mornings. The way the mist sat on the water before the sun cleared the trees. Helen in her old green sweater on the dock with her second coffee. Bradley as a boy, 12 years old, standing at the end of that dock the summer he caught his first bass, holding it up with both hands and grinning so wide it seemed like his face couldn't hold it. That boy was still somewhere in the man who had called me on a Tuesday morning and used the word practical 3 times. I couldn't fix that. I knew I couldn't fix that. But I could deal with what was in front of me. The purchaser's solicitor, a thorough woman from Barrie named Ms. Tran, had put the transaction on hold pending resolution of the trustee issue. She was professional and clearly unamused by the complication. The purchaser, a couple from Toronto who had been planning to use the cottage as a vacation property, were understandably frustrated. Frank communicated everything clearly and without hostility. By the third week of November, Bradley's lawyer had advised him that the transaction would require either Evelyn's written confirmation or a court order overriding the trustee clause, and that the latter would be costly, time-consuming, and uncertain in outcome given that the clause had been validly created and registered. Bradley called me on a Sunday evening. He didn't sound cheerful. He didn't sound angry either, which surprised me. He sounded, for the first time in a while, like himself. "I didn't read the deed," he said. "No. I assumed the POA covered everything." "You assumed," I said. "I know." There was a long pause. Outside my window it had started to snow, the first real snow of the season, and the maple was catching it on the bare branches. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have talked to you. I should have asked." I had been waiting for that. I hadn't let myself expect it, but I had been waiting for it. "Yes," I said, "you should have. Is there any way to still make the Calgary thing work?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on what you actually need and what you're willing to do differently. But that's a conversation, not a transaction." He exhaled slowly. "Okay. Bradley, I want you to know something. This was never about the money. Do you understand that?" Another pause. "I think I'm starting to," he said. The sale did not close. The purchaser eventually withdrew and their deposit was returned per the terms of the agreement, given the unresolved title issue. The cottage remained in my name. Bradley and Anita did move to Calgary, but 2 months later, and on a different financial footing than they planned, they used money from their own savings and a conversation with a mortgage broker, which is how it should have been from the start. It wasn't easy for them. I know that. I'm not going to pretend the whole thing resolved neatly into a family dinner and nobody mentioned it again, because that isn't true. What is true is that last August, for the first time in 3 years, I drove up the 400 and turned off at the Muskoka exit and went up the gravel lane and unlocked the cottage door. Bradley and his family came up the following weekend. His daughter, who was 7 now, spent 40 minutes standing on the dock, dropping pieces of bread into the water for the ducks, and narrating each piece's journey in extraordinary detail. At one point she turned around and looked at me sitting in the chair at the end of the dock and said, "Grandpa, why are you crying?" "I'm not," I said. "It's the wind." She looked at the flat, glassy water, completely still in the morning, calm, and gave me a look that suggested she was 7, not stupid. "Okay," she said, and went back to the ducks. I sat there for a long time after that, listening to the sound of the lake. I think about Bradley's face sometimes. Not the face he had when he called me that Tuesday morning, the one I couldn't see but could hear clearly enough, that cheerful, slightly impatient tone, but the face he had as a boy on that dock, holding up that base with both hands. That's the face I come back to when I try to make sense of everything that happened. What I've come to understand is that the things we do in the name of practicality can sometimes be the least practical things of all. Bradley didn't set out to hurt me. I genuinely believe that. He saw a number, he saw an opportunity, he saw a path to the wife he wanted, and he reached for it without stopping to ask whether the reaching itself would cost him something he couldn't get back. That's not cruelty. It's a failure of character in a quieter way. A failure to pause, to consider, to ask the harder question before taking the easy action. I spent 34 years practicing law. In that time I saw more families torn apart by estate disputes than I care to remember, and almost none of those disputes were really about money. They were about being overlooked, about someone deciding, without asking, that they knew better, about one person's convenience becoming another person's loss. I thought I understood that. I thought my family understood it too, because I had tried to raise my son to understand it. When it happened to me anyway, I had to sit with the uncomfortable fact that understanding something in the abstract and living by it under pressure are two entirely different things. What pulled me through wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. Anger is useful for about 48 hours, and then it starts costing you more than it costs anyone else. What pulled me through was something steadier, a willingness to think clearly when everything in me wanted to react, and a refusal to let someone else's poor judgment become the final word on something I had spent 31 years building with my wife. That steadiness, I think, is something you have to earn. It doesn't come from being right, or from being the wronged party. It comes from having been tested before, from having learned somewhere along the way that the way you respond to a difficult thing says more about you than the difficult thing itself. Helen used to say that character is just behavior under pressure. I argued with her about the phrasing once, as lawyers do, and she gave me a look that meant she was right and we both knew it. Bradley made a mistake. He made it because somewhere in the years between that doc and that phone call, he had let something slip. The habit of stopping to consider the people behind the decisions he was making. I don't say that to condemn him. I say it because I watched him find it again, slowly, over the months that followed. That recovery mattered to me more than winning the legal argument. The cottage is still there. The dock needs new boards at the far end, and I've been putting it off because getting someone up to Muskoka in the fall is more complicated than it sounds. I'll deal with it in the spring. Bradley's daughter wants to learn to fish this summer, and I've promised her I'll teach her, and I intend to keep that promise. Some things are worth protecting, not because of what they cost, but because of what they carry.